I want to invite up now a man named David Meyers. David Meyers' family is a family that owns a travel company that does trips to Israel. And what he wants to talk to you about is what it's like in Israel. His family is Messianic Jews. His father's been around there for a long time. I won't say too much. I'll let him talk. Please welcome up David Meyers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got 7 pages to go through here. But yeah, it's been a while since I've spoken in front of such a crowd, so you'll excuse me for reading out at least part of it. So shalom, my name is David Meyers, and I moved here to the United States, actually to San Diego some 4 years ago with my wife and now 4 children. And it's a long way away from home, and it's a long way from our families, but Southern California, being Southern California, made us feel at home very quickly. The landscape, the relaxed atmosphere reminds us of back home. My kids adjusted very quickly, all 4 of them, and we moved in November, and Halloween became one of their favorites. Immediately after came the entire holiday season with Christmas, Hanukkah, so they have learned to enjoy both Jewish and Christian holidays, and they are loving life here in the United States. For my wife and myself, we felt relaxed, at ease. We had time. We suddenly had more time with our kids. We had more time for hobbies. So why am I telling you this? Because I'll be telling you a little bit about the differences between living here in the United States and growing up and living in Israel. And I see that there's so many families and kids here, and very relevant. And if any of you do make it out to Israel, you'll pick up on those small little differences. So in Israel, in a very different manner, one of the things is we are very short on time. We seem to be very busy, very tense. Life in Israel is pretty intense, and we live in a very intense neighborhood. And none of that is to reflect that we are not a happy nation. In fact, on the United Nations scale of happy nations, Israel, out of 155 nations that are on that scale, ranks 11th, ahead of the United States by 4 places. So we are happier, for some reason. The one thing you will notice in Israel is the intensity. A lot of different people, a lot of different cultures. The days start very early, and the days end very late. So when we moved to California, one of the contractors working on our house here, asked us about, our habits in Israel, and my wife said, oh yeah, and then we'll go out for dinner at about 9:30. And he said, no, you won't. Not here, you won't. And, in Israel, you go out for dinner. When you say you're going out for dinner, you're going out at 9:30, 10, 11 o'clock is not uncommon to go out for dinner with your family. Most kitchens in Southern California close at around 9, I think, as we quickly found out. But, of course, there are different ways of life in Israel as well. You could choose to live in a kibbutz. You could live in a different agricultural settlement, either in the middle of the desert or in the Galilee. But like most Californians, Israelis too are drawn to the coast. So I would say about 70% of Israelis live along the coastline. Cultural differences exist in Israel, with us being a young nation, predominantly 75% Jews, which have come from places as far apart as the United States, Russia, Africa, Eastern Europe, from all around the world. So you find Israel a melting pot of cultures. Growing up in Israel in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, as a son to Hebrew Christian parents, it wasn't always very clear-cut for me. We lived in a period where many Holocaust survivors were trying to come to terms with raising families. The Jewish identity question was a very, very dominant one. And for suddenly your child to be going to school with a non-Jew, that could have been a challenge to some. As I said, those years, the 70s, were very difficult years in Israel. We were living between wars. So Second World War was behind us. A lot of Holocaust survivors that survived, obviously, the Holocaust came to Israel, settled in Israel, and died on battlefields defending the young state of Israel. Others had their children die on battlefields, such as the Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War. So the 70s were very challenging years. I remember, in fact, once in Israel, we go to church on a Shabbat, on a Saturday. Sunday is a normal working day. So we were sitting around the table on one Saturday morning. I'm 7 years old, and my father says grace, and he stands up and collapses. And he was rushed to hospital. 10 days later, he was released from hospital. For my mother to be told by the doctors that he was physically fine, but as a Holocaust survivor, this is something that they have seen again and again and again. The memories come back, and at one point, it hits them very hard. My father, again, was in hospital for 10 days. But we moved on, and we grew in a little suburb just outside of Tel Aviv, and my neighborhood was mainly Ashkenazi Jews, so mainly Jews that had survived the Holocaust. And we had one neighbor right next to us who was actually a British soldier that decided, well, he fell in love with an Israeli girl, and when his regiment left with the British mandate ended in the state of Israel, and he left back to England, they left back to England, he stayed back and helped with building of the state of Israel. And I remember when the Yom Kippur War broke out, and that was a war that was a very tough war on the civil population of Israel as well. He took care of my sister and myself and cheered us up when my father was taken into reserves. And indeed, those years, the 70s were very challenging, as I said, but Israel has grown and has prospered. And all that despite the fact, and I go back to the fact that we live in a very hostile neighborhood. Now, what does that mean? Today, some of you will have an opportunity these days to visit Israel. Any point of where you are in Israel, and I was talking to the mayor earlier, you're about 100 miles away from the furthest point in Israel. So when you arrive in Israel today, you are about 100 miles away from where the Syrian Holocaust is happening these days. And yet you are very, very safe. But what happens in the Middle East and the reality that we face as Israelis is something that is very, very difficult to comprehend. And like you said earlier, you here in America, you have a lot to be thankful for your way of life and for the privileges you have. And, you know, growing up in Israel, I remember traveling with my parents to Europe. And again, as a kid, I thought that, you know, we must be very important people, you know. Everyone, you know, would ask, where are you from? You say you're from Israel. Everybody had something to say about it. And back in those days, it was mainly good things, you know. People would hear you're from Israel, they'd be very sympathetic, and those things have changed. And to me, Israel is a symbol of pride. Israel, in its very short history, and we are today celebrating two major events. One, 50 years for the reuniting of the city of Jerusalem, and the second is our 70th anniversary. But, you know, in 70 years, if you come to Israel and you look around you and you'll say to yourself, wow, this happened in 70 years, I think it is a wonder. It is really a wonder. And Israel is the second in the world after Silicon Valley for startups. So many technologies you were talking about, like you were saying, any mobile phone, any communication devices today in the world, we are one of the only 8 nations to have launched satellites. Yet we only are 1.6% of the population of the Middle East. The one thing that I want to say is Israel has achieved a lot, but Israel hasn't achieved it all by itself. And I think it's very important for me to stand here today and also say a very big thank you to all of you, to the United States of America. I remember as a child in 1973 when enemy planes and the Israeli F-4s were flying over my neighborhood. We looked to the sky and there was like a train of massive aircrafts coming in from the United States, reinforcing Israel. And that special relationship, I believe, goes all the way back to the city of Jerusalem. That commitment and that knowledge of the Bible that you all have, and that faith that you have, is what brings us together. So we are very thankful to all of you. I asked my father, who is 86 years old, and his life was bought from the Nazis by the Hebrew Christian Alliance in the United States. So my father was born Jewish, lived in the city of Wuppertal. His entire family was taken to the concentration camp and never seen again. But my father and 2 of his brothers' lives were bought by the Hebrew Christian Alliance in the United States. They actually paid the Nazis for the lives of 10,000 children. And my father was one of those children. And he, back in the 60s, set up one of the first travel agencies to bring Christians from around the world into Israel. And my father is still the CEO of the company, very active, gets up very early every morning and works a full day, and still goes out and visits almost every group that comes from any part of the world. And so I told him, listen, I'm going to be talking in this church in Moriela, and I told him, you know, there are two questions that I'd love you to answer. And if it's okay, I'll end just by reading to you exactly what my father wrote. So he wrote, a frequently asked question which we all face is why a journey to the Holy Land is of value and importance to a Christian visitor, and why is it of special importance today? In answer to the first question, I would say that Christian pilgrimage to the land of Israel, the land of the Bible, is a long-standing tradition going right back to the beginning of the Christian era. Pilgrims came from all parts of the then known world with a strong desire to see for themselves the place where the Word was made flesh. Walking in the footsteps of Jesus Christ and following the traces of the history of salvation in the land in which it took place. The long and tedious journey of the early pilgrims to the Holy Land was fraught by dangers, but those who succeeded in reaching the goal of their desire were richly rewarded. By coming to the place where the spiritual roots of every Christian are to be found, they found that familiar names which most of us have known from an early age in teaching which we received at home or in church, such as Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, they actually exist and are not just places or names which are read out in the Bible. To quote from the words of an experienced tour leader to the Holy Land, the land of Israel is the best classroom for teaching the Bible. The Bible makes the land come alive, and the land makes the Bible come alive. A Benedictine monk named Bragil Pixner, who lived in Israel for 25 years, wrote, 5 Gospels record the life of Jesus, of which 4 you will find in the Bible, and 1 you will find in the land they call holy. Read the 5th Gospel, and the word of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament will be more understandable and open to you. As the second question about the special importance of undertaking a tour or pilgrimage during these days, we know that many Christians are convinced that we are living in the end of times, and that many of the signs which Jesus taught his disciples before his ascension have taken place, and that the last signs will happen in Jerusalem and in the land of Israel. Of special interest to Christian visitors to Israel is the miracle of the return of the Jews to their land after more than 2,000 years in exile. Sadly, this fact is being widely disputed in many countries in the world, with the growth of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. A Norwegian friend of ours who has personally led more than 100 tour groups to Israel, has said that from his experience, the best way of countering anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial is to bring people to Israel, so that they see for themselves what God has done. You visit Israel and you will never be the same. I would like to thank Pastor Tim and Nadav from Love to Travel for the opportunity to be here with you today. And I'll be glad to answer any questions or concerns. And people have a lot of concerns when it comes to visiting Israel. So I'll be glad to answer any of your questions. Thank you and shalom.